In the long shadow of the Cold War, when the world held its breath for missiles in Cuba and watched Berlin split in two, a war erupted far above the clouds. It was fought not in the headlines of the New York Times, nor in the war rooms of NATO or the Kremlin, but in the frozen passes of the Himalayas between the two most populous nations on Earth, India and China. The year was 1962, and while the world feared Armageddon in the Caribbean, thousands of troops were locked in silent. Brutal combat on the roof of the world. But why did the world forget? Why did two ancient civilizations, both rising from colonial ruins, both preaching peace, suddenly erupt into war? This is not just the story of bullets and borders. It is the story of pride, betrayal, and a fault line that remains unsettled. Even today. Part 2. Historical setup, the timeline. To understand the firestorm of 1962, we must begin much earlier in the age of maps drawn with ink and imperial arrogance. In the 19th century, as British India expanded into the mountains and Qing China clung to its empire, neither side could agree on where one realm ended and the other began. The Himalayas, remote and unforgiving, were perfect for ambiguity and perfect for conflict. But the frontier wasn't between London and Beijing. It was between British India and Tibet, a unique theocracy nestled in the clouds. Tibet was, in theory, a vassal of the Qing dynasty. In practice, it governed itself. The British, seizing this ambiguity, imposed the Ardagh-Johnson line, pushing their claim deep into the high plains of Aksai Chin, a cold, desolate desert plateau. They never asked Beijing. They didn't need to. Later, in a rare moment of caution, British diplomats offered the Macartney-MacDonald line to the Qing in 1899, conceding Aksai Chin to China, but the Qing never responded. Meanwhile, in the east, another line, the McMahon Line, was drawn in 1914. This time, Britain negotiated with Tibet alone, excluding the Chinese once again. The result was a new map, one that gave India control of what is now Arunachal Pradesh, a lush, strategic region stretching deep into the eastern Himalayas. When India gained independence in 1947, it inherited these conflicting lines, and also the conflicts behind them. Then came the spark. In 1950, Communist China invaded Tibet. For centuries, Tibet had been a buffer, spiritually distinct, diplomatically tricky, but geographically crucial. Now, it was gone. Beijing began absorbing Tibet into its system. And with that move, China and India became direct neighbors and rivals. At first, India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, tried friendship. He dreamed of an Asian axis, a peaceful coalition of post-colonial powers that could rival the West and the Soviet Union. India had no interest in Cold War alliances. Nehru believed in non-alignment. But as the 1950s progressed, reality caught up with idealism. In 1957, Indian intelligence discovered something shocking. China had built a road through Aksai Chin, connecting Tibet with the western region of Xinjiang, cutting directly through territory. India claimed as its own. For Nehru, it was an insult. But it was also a wake-up call. India began hardening its stance, and voices within the government urged more assertive action. But militarily, India was ill-prepared for a confrontation in the Himalayas. Meanwhile, inside Tibet, rebellion simmered. In 1959, the Tibetan people rose up, the culmination of years of suppression. China crushed the revolt brutally. But one man escaped. The Dalai Lama, spiritual leader of Tibet, fled over the mountains into India and was granted asylum. For Beijing, this was a humiliation. India, once a hopeful friend, was now harboring a symbol of Tibetan resistance. Bolder skirmishes followed, diplomats talked, guns fired, but nothing was resolved. By the early 1960s, both India and China had crossed the Rubicon. On paper, both nations claimed they wanted peace. In reality, both were digging in for a fight. In New Delhi, the tone hardened. A new military policy, known as the Forward Policy, was launched. It directed Indian troops to establish a series of advanced outposts along the disputed Himalayan frontier, some deep into Chinese claimed territory. The logic was simple: occupy the land, and you reinforce the claim, but in a region where mountains were cliffs and valleys were death traps. This was a risky gamble. China, for its part, was not about to let the high ground slip away. In public, Chairman Mao spoke of coexistence, but behind closed doors, he was seething. If Nehru wants to advance, we'll advance too. Let's wave guns at each other. Let's practice our courage. This wasn't just a border dispute anymore. It was a test of will, pride, and global alignment. Beijing saw India as trying to peel Tibet away again. India saw China's new roads and patrols as creeping aggression. To complicate matters, the United States had refused India's initial pleas for military aid, viewing Nehru's non-alignment as too sympathetic to socialism. Ironically, the Soviet Union, recently split with China over ideology, was more responsive. For the first time, Moscow leaned toward Delhi. But time was not on India's side. Its troops were ill-equipped, undertrained, and spread thin across vast, freezing mountains. China, by contrast, had well-supplied regiments, hardened by years of mountain operations and internal suppression. The stage was set. Then, the trigger came. On the 10th of October, 1962, Indian soldiers attempted to push Chinese troops off a ridge in Thagla, a contested area. 50 Indian troops encountered roughly 1,000 Chinese. At first, they held their ground heroically, repelling the first wave, but outnumbered and outgunned, they were eventually overwhelmed. And yet, something unexpected happened. The Chinese, after taking the position, buried the Indian dead with full military honors, a gesture not of kindness, but of warning. 10 days later, on the 20th of October, as the world's gaze turned toward the Cuban Missile Crisis, Chinese forces struck. It was a perfectly timed blow. While Kennedy and Khrushchev traded threats over nuclear weapons, the Chinese launched a full assault across both the eastern and western Himalayas. In the east, their objective, to break Indian resistance along the Namkachu River. Indian forces had foolishly expected the Chinese to cross at known bridges. But instead, Chinese troops forded the river, bypassed the Indian defenses, and attacked in full strength, nearly 3 regiments against a single Indian battalion. It was not a battle, it was a rout. Indian lines collapsed. Troops retreated into Bhutan and Beijing, perhaps signaling restraint, did not pursue beyond its border. 4 days later, the picture became clearer. This was not a mere skirmish. In the west, over 40,000 Chinese troops surged into Aksai Chin, easily overwhelming the few thousand Indian defenders scattered across isolated outposts. They struck at night, took high ground, and launched coordinated assaults that left the Indian command reeling. By the 24th of October, China had seized large swaths of disputed territory, but then something curious happened. Beijing paused. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai sent a diplomatic note to Nehru, proposing a mutual withdrawal of 12 miles from the current positions. China would retreat behind the McMahon Line in the east. India would stop contesting Aksai Chin in the west. It was, in effect, an offer for de-escalation, a chance to restore calm. But Nehru hesitated. To accept the terms would mean acknowledging territorial loss. To reject them meant risking full-scale war. Nehru chose to resist. India declared a national emergency. Western powers, now suddenly alarmed, began airlifting weapons and sending aid, but the damage was done. On the 14th of November, Nehru's birthday, Indian troops launched a counterattack at Walong, inflicting casualties on the Chinese, but ultimately failing to dislodge them. 4 days later, the Chinese response was swift and brutal. They attacked at Raising La and Gurung Hill, key strategic heights. Indian position crumbled. Then, just as suddenly as it began, China stopped. On the 19th of November, the People's Liberation Army declared a unilateral ceasefire. They announced a withdrawal not from all captured territory, but from most of Arunachal Pradesh in Aksai Chin. They held onto just enough land to protect their road from Xinjiang to Tibet. No war was ever formally declared. No air forces were used. No capitals were bombed. But the damage, psychological and geopolitical, was permanent. The ceasefire of November 1962 brought the guns to a halt, but it did not bring peace. There were no victory parades, no treaties signed on aircraft carriers, just silence cold. High-altitude silence across the line of actual control. And yet, the fallout would transform both India and China for decades to come. For India, the war was a national trauma. The country that had championed peace, non-alignment, and coexistence had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and humiliated on the world stage. Nehru, the towering father of Indian independence, was devastated. He had believed in Asian solidarity. He had trusted Mao's China, and he had underestimated the cost of inaction. Within a year, Nehru's health declined sharply. He died in 1964, broken by war and betrayal. But from the ashes of defeat came a new India, one that learned fast. The Indian military underwent rapid modernization. Defense budgets soared. Military academies were reformed. A new mountain warfare doctrine was born. And critically, nuclear weapons entered the conversation. India realized that moral high ground could not defend mountain passes. It would no longer rely solely on diplomacy or idealism. On the geopolitical front, the war reshaped alliances. While India had long stayed neutral, the Western world suddenly warmed to Delhi. The United States and United Kingdom shipped arms. Military advisors were dispatched, and for a brief moment, India and the West stood on the same side of a mountain wall. But the implications rippled far beyond Delhi. Pakistan, India's bitter rival, watched with satisfaction and alarm. Islamabad had long aligned with the United States as a bulwark against communism. But now, Washington was arming its enemy, India. This shift felt like betrayal. So Pakistan did something radical. It turned toward China. The wounds of 1962 became the seed of the China-Pakistan strategic partnership, one that would reshape South Asian security for generations. On the Chinese side, the war confirmed a brutal lesson. You can fight, win decisively, and still claim moral superiority so long as you retreat first. China had humiliated India on the battlefield, seized strategic ground, and then voluntarily de-escalated. In doing so, they avoided long-term occupation but sent an unambiguous message about their power and resolve. And all of it had been timed to perfection. While the Cuban Missile Crisis dominated headlines, China had staged an entire war under the radar of global scrutiny. No United Nations intervention, no global outcry, just a cold, efficient blow, and then silence. But beneath the surface, deeper dynamics were at play. In Beijing, Chairman Mao saw the war not just as a border defense, but as a test of political survival. Internally, China had just emerged from the disastrous Great Leap Forward, a campaign that caused tens of millions of deaths through famine and mismanagement. Mao's reputation had been battered. His control, questioned. The war with India became a rallying cry, a chance to reassert his dominance, throw over China's unity, and remind the world that Beijing would defend its borders with blood, if necessary. This is not a border war. One Chinese general reportedly said, "It is a political war fought for discipline, unity, and respect." It worked. Mao reconsolidated power, the military basked in newfound prestige, and China gained a territorial buffer it holds to this day. Meanwhile, in the borderlands, the human cost was immeasurable. Entire villages were uprooted. Tibetan resistance fighters who had hoped for Indian support were left stranded. Families living in the misty valleys of Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin now found themselves citizens of a disputed nowhere. The line of actual control, the de facto border, since 1962 became not just a military reality, but a symbol of unresolved trauma. And that line still holds. There has been no formal peace treaty, no final border agreement, just a tense, heavily militarized silence. In 2020, nearly 6 decades after the war, soldiers from both nations clashed once more in the Gawan Valley. The weapons were crude iron rods, stones, the fists, but the bloodshed was real. It was a chilling reminder. This war is not over